Okay, I think I'm on. Hello, everyone. It is Tuesday, the 28th of January, 2025, and the sun is really bright this morning, so it's better when I'm here. But I'm going to get into quantum physics and elementary particles, hot and cold fusion, electricity versus magnetism, and but before I get into any of that stuff, it's all really complicated. So I'm going to get through it. I'm going to share a lot of videos. But before I get into that, it's something that I share on my social media in the last few days. But because I haven't been doing videos because I was so busy, I got to tell you this now. So Musk's AI company, xAI specifically, nears 10 billion deal to rent Oracle's AI servers. So this was posted a while ago. And so Elon Musk directly profits from doesn't directly profit, but works with Oracle is what I wanted to say. And so, and his platforms and his the satellites that he has on various aircrafts, and he there's wide reach. He has reach internationally, right? And so if he's working with like Oracle and Pegasus, like I've been saying before, and Palantir and Oz and things like that, he could easily, again, like this biodigital convergence I've been talking about, and this mass surveillance. Again, it could be very fast. And Stargate, again, $500 billion that Trump announced to be given to them, and Oracle owns Stargate. And so very interesting stuff. I also wanted to talk about shares and stocks in different companies, because a lot of people think that that should all be abolished. And so I am what you would classify as an ethical trader, or someone that recommends ethical trades. And so for things like I've done whiteboards for years where I'm showing like where there's going to be possible staged and planned events and wars and all this stuff, and who would be involved, and which companies would profit and benefit from that. And I could have very easily had shares and stocks, for example, like Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, General Dynamics, all these different organizations, these AI companies as well. And I've been talking about that for years as well, especially the private AI companies. And anyway, but I think that makes it where I'm enabling these like the outcomes, right? Like with if like the people like Raytheon, for example, with the and Lockheed Martin, like with advanced technologies, like the more you're giving their company and the more they profit, right? It's again, it's supply and demand. I hope that makes sense. But if you're going to do things like invest in things like free energy companies, or companies that try to clean up the earth and try to clean up the oceans, and then like proper recycling and refurbishing companies, there's so many different companies out there that where you can invest in, and it would actually be like a good thing, right? And so I still think that free trade and capitalism to a certain degree does work. It does benefit societies, and a meritocracy or a merit-based society as well. Anyway, other things I can get into, but I really wanted to get into that one. And then even with the connection with JD Vance and Palantir and Peter Thiel and the CIA. And so if the CIA didn't lie and cover up so many different events, then maybe there would be more trust, right? But at this point, there's not. And I hope that people like Dan Bongino and Kash Patel and Pete Hegseth and stuff like that, again, listen to people that are aware of the reality of the world, and like even again with space and fake and staged alien invasions and Project Bluebeam and all this other shit, like just be aware that like we can't even leave this pressurized, contained environment. All right, so I guess that's like alluding to, I was watching a video on the Tao of physics, so very interesting. And so I made a comment: a particle physicist should know that the moon is plasma, which that's just my opinion, and that we cannot land on it or the other luminaries. The sun and the moon are possibly plasma ionized gases, different states of matter in some form of contained environment with a circular base, which may be why we only ever see 50% of the moon. The other luminaries look like they function using cymatics. This is a pressurized contained environment with elemental particles in different states that vary in form dependent on pressure, temperature, and density, and interact with the two forces or energies, electricity and magnetism, pushing and pulling, positive, negative, centrifugal versus centripetal, yin yang. Anyway, interact with 2-4. So our DNA are fractal antennas that also interact with light and sound. Electricity and magnetism are the mediums used to store and transmit this universe. Anyway, that's just my opinion on that. I hope that wasn't, yeah. And so particles make waves, right? So like sound waves, light waves. I believe that this is like a particle-based reality, a projection, whatever you want to call it, light and sound. Yeah, lots to unpack. Yeah, I believe there's a creator. I believe there's or an engineer of sorts that created this cosmos or universe, whatever you want to call it. And there could be many, many, many others. But sorry, I've been up so early and I was looking at a lot of science and my brain was just about to explode.
Flaky reputation. But today I have some cold fusion could save the world. Unfortunately, it's got somewhat of a flaky reputation. But today I have some quite remarkable news. A group of physicists say they know how cold fusion works. Theoretically, someone just needs to do it. And that's a welcome change from people with devices that don't work even theoretically. So let's have a look. When two small atomic nuclei join to form a larger one, enormous amounts of energy can be released. The problem with this nuclear fusion is that atomic nuclei are all positively charged. For them to fuse, one has to overcome the electric repulsion between the nuclei until the strong nuclear force takes over. Crossing this so-called Coulomb barrier requires a lot of energy at first, but the fusion itself frees more energy than it requires. Usually one tries to cross the Coulomb barrier like the sun does, with enormous heat and pressure. Cold fusion, in contrast, is the idea that one doesn't need this, that instead one can deposit the nuclei into some solid-state material, and that this will lower the electrostatic repulsion between them. Usually one uses deuterium, that's an isotope of hydrogen, as the nuclei to fuse, and puts it in a metal like palladium for the solid-state object. Cold fusion has an unfortunate history of fraud, hype, and just bad science, which we talked about in an earlier episode, but it's not all bad science. There's reliable evidence that some solid-state materials actually do enhance nuclear fusion rates. Sandia Lab, for example, builds a device called the Nutristor that sends a low-energy beam of deuterium into a titanium plate. The deuterium accumulates in the plate until it starts to fuse. This emits neutrons, so they use it as a neutron generator. However, it's an example of cold fusion, just that the beam takes more energy to create than one gets out from the fusion. There's also been tentative evidence that aiming a pulsed laser at the palladium with deuterium will stimulate fusion for specific pulse frequencies. This suggests that phonon excitations have something to do with it, though this finding hasn't been replicated consistently. The authors of the new paper now say there are 3 separate mechanisms for cold fusion. Each on its own is too small an effect, but all 3 together could just make it work. The first mechanism is in the atomic range. Remember that the problem with nuclear fusion is the electric repulsion between the nuclei. Now imagine you could put a thin slice of negative electric charge between them. Then the nuclei wouldn't notice each other as they get closer. Something similar could happen in solid-state lattices near defects where the electron wave function becomes focused and forms a sort of shield between the deuterium nuclei. In the paper, they write that this can enhance the fusion rate by a whopping 25 orders of magnitude. The second mechanism they discuss is nuclear resonance between several of the nuclei that you want to fuse. This can be triggered, for example, with the pulsed lasers that I mentioned earlier. earlier. They say that the reason this works is that it causes a deformation of the nuclei that effectively lowers the energy you need to make them approach. Unfortunately, creating this resonance eats up energy similar to what would be released during the fusion. They conjecture, however, that similar resonances could exist at lower energy and estimate that this could lead to an enhancement of 7 orders of magnitude of fusion probability. The third mechanism they discuss in the paper is that the presence of the larger nuclei in the material facilitates the fusion of the smaller nuclei by aiding a quantum tunneling process. This superficially makes sense because we know that nuclei can aid quantum processes that are otherwise impossible. For example, an electron can normally not just emit a photon. However, put the electron in the vicinity of an atomic nucleus, and that process can happen thanks to momentum exchange with the nucleus. For cold fusion, they say something similar takes place. The small nuclei that you want to fuse can temporarily borrow energy from the surrounding nuclei, fuse, and then give that energy back. They estimate that this could lead to an increase of fusion rates upwards of 30 orders of magnitude. Take it all together, they say, and these effects can enhance the fusion rate in materials enough for it to produce net energy. They also outline ways to test these individual mechanisms to learn more about them, most importantly by using specific materials that have controlled amounts of traces of other elements in them. If you've already forgotten half of what I said, I made a quiz that lets you check how much you remember. What are we to make of this? I suspect that the first effect, the atomic one, exists but happens too rarely. The second one exists but eats up too much energy. And the third one I'm not sure exists, which in other contexts is called the Holy Trinity. That said, I strongly support further studies on cold fusion because these are low-cost, small lab experiments with a potentially huge payoff. And if it works out, not only would we have basically unlimited clean energy, we'd also have amazing material for a blockbuster movie. It could be called Honey, I Shrunk the Coulomb Barrier, or The Man Who Knew Too Much.
Okay.
Luckily, I changed my number 3 years ago, and the one that time you open a website, it'll try to collect data about who you are.
Bear with me.
I recently fell into a rabbit hole of conspiracy theories about how the US government, it's always the US government, is supposedly hiding some anti-gravity technology from us, some way to access the energy of the vacuum and whatnot. This isn't an entirely new story, but the recent episode was triggered by the Cybertruck bomber. That was when, on the morning of January 1st, a Tesla Cybertruck exploded in front of the Trump International Hotel in Las Vegas. It later transpired that the person responsible for the explosion, Matthew Allen Leivesberger, had previously sent an email to a retired intelligence officer by the name of some shoemate. In his email, Leivesberger wrote, among other things, that what we've been seeing with drones is the operational use of gravitic propulsion systems, powered aircraft by most recently China in the East Coast, but throughout history the US. Only we in China have this capability. China has been launching them from the Atlantic from submarines for years, but this activity recently has picked up. I've no idea what a gravitic propulsion system might be, even theoretically, and I'm a theoretical physicist who's worked on gravity for more than 20 years. Of course, that may just be proof that I'm a secret agent of the US government. That German accent is all fake. The idea that there's some conspiracy going on to hide new physics has been a theme on social media since Mark Andreessen quoted someone associated with the actual US government saying that they'd made a lot of maths disappear during the nuclear era.
So Ben basically said, look, it doesn't make sense because to regulate AI at the technology level, you're regulating math. And of course, we're not going to do that. Like, that doesn't make any sense. And you'll recall that what they said was, no, actually,
we can classify math.
we can classify math. And literally, this is verbatim. We classified whole entire areas of physics in the nuclear era and made them state secrets. Like of the
classified physics, made them state secrets. This is why people like myself literally had to come to these conclusions on my own, looking at researching various different topics that they separate from each other, and then being able to come up with like a bigger picture based on just like other research. It's not a brag or anything like that. This is frustrating. Like, this is stuff that should be taught in schools, not classified, and the reality of the world as well. And anyway.
Theoretical
physics,
science of physics. We totally classified them and made them state secrets, and that research vanished. And we are absolutely capable of doing that again for AI. We will classify any area of math that we think is leading in a bad direction, and it will end.
And at the same time, we have Eric Weinstein, who claims that he's been ignored with his idea of geometric unity, which could help us make contact with additional dimensions and greatly advance space travel.
What kind of power would have to be generated? Like, what would be involved?
So what wouldn't be involved
through these avatars
is getting an entire planet to put a tiny dent in space-time, because that's not going to work. It would be a question of saying, I know about more degrees of freedom. Are those degrees of freedom accessible? Maybe the new degrees of freedom are things we can play with at the engineering level, and maybe they're inaccessible just the way we can't play with up quarks and down quarks directly. If we can play with it, then we've got so many new toys, you have no idea. New forces, new matter, new possibilities to flit in and out between dark and light matter.
But from an engineering perspective, how would you make any of this happen?
You would build something based on new plans that did something that nothing else could do.
So today I want to try and put these things into context. Can you actually make maths disappear? And is it conceivably possible that someone has made the maths of some super propulsion devices in particular disappear? To answer the first question, yes, you can make maths disappear. That's undoubtedly happened in the past and is still happening. But it only makes sense if that maths isn't something that many other people could easily rediscover. In the early days of the nuclear era, there was a lot that physicists didn't understand, and the maths was genuinely new. Just exactly how which nuclei decay into what, and how much energy does this release, and how many neutrons does this capture, and so on. These sorts of experiments are not that difficult or expensive to reproduce, but they take time. That's leaving aside that you need to get your hands on some plutonium, but maybe LinkedIn can help you out. So this is one reason you classify maths, to stay ahead of the competition. However, there came a point where the physics of nuclear chain reactions was so widely known that it didn't make sense to keep this under covers any longer. It's another thing entirely with the technological details for how to build a good and efficient nuclear bomb. It takes a lot of time and testing and tinkering. Keeping this maths top secret makes a lot of sense because it's not something that anyone can easily reproduce. When it comes to AI, it's a similar story as with nuclear bombs. You don't just build a $1 billion frontier model in your basement and play around with it. If some big AI company works out a way for how to make their models super intelligent, it can make sense to classify that maths exactly.
Okay, but at this point, though, like, even with Pegasus, I've mentioned this before in other videos, but like, again, these AI companies, Pegasus is a spyware developed by the Israeli cyber arms company NSO Group that is designed to be covertly and remotely installed on mobile phones running iOS and Android. While NSO Group markets Pegasus as a product for fighting crime and terrorism, governments around the world have routinely used the spyware to survey journalists, lawyers, political dissidents, and human rights activists. The sale of Pegasus licenses to foreign governments must be approved by the Israeli Ministry of Defense. As of March 23, Pegasus operators were able to remotely install the spyware on iOS versions through 16.0.3 using a zero-click exploit. While the capabilities of Pegasus may vary over time due to software updates, Pegasus is generally capable of reading text messages, call snooping, collecting passwords, location tracking, accessing the target device's microphone and camera, and harvesting information from apps like Amazon, like audio, like your purchase history. Anyway, yeah. So again, these other companies that I mentioned as well, they're doing the same things.
Because it's not something that others can easily reproduce. That's not to say that I'd advocate doing this. I'm just saying it's possible and it would almost certainly work. So much about the question of math's classification. Now let's talk about the gravitic device, or the idea that some grand unified theory will help us travel through the cosmos.
If you want to go a very long distance, one possibility is that you do something very energetically expensive. But the other possibility is grow the ruler to shrink the distance. If the rulers and protractors that Einstein used, and he chose one through his equation.
Good job in his podcast in trying to get Eric to explain just how this unification-based space travel technology should supposedly work. And Eric basically says repeatedly, I don't know. But the truth is more boring. We know it won't work. If there are hidden sectors of particles in your grand unified theory, like there are in Eric's theory and in all other similar theories, then we already know that we can't do anything with them, because if that was possible, we'd already have found evidence for them. This is a point I'm afraid that a lot of people, including some mathematicians, don't understand about the foundations of physics. You can't just invent some new stuff, particles, forces, extra dimensions, and say, hey, it'll help us travel through the cosmos. You have to explain why. If we can do anything with it, haven't we seen it already? And no, you can't classify experimental data coming out of multiple international collaborations with several 10,000 people. This is conspiracy thinking. If physicists had seen anything new at particle colliders that didn't fit into the existing theories, we'd know about it. What we do know is that if there is any new physics left to discover, it's forces or particles that are either A, extremely weak or weakly interacting, or B, require extremely high energies to access, or C, it's not new forces or particles. I'll explain this latter point in a moment, but A and B is why particle physicists all follow the same playbook for introducing new physics. It's always a fifth force that's incredibly weak, or a particle that decays quickly, or that's very heavy, and so on. Why do you think they're doing this? Are they just not daring enough to invent something more interesting, like a beam that opens a portal into another dimension that we can go through? No, they don't do that because they don't know any way to make something more interesting compatible with what we know already. This isn't something you need to classify. There's nothing there.
Yep.
Let's then talk a little about those gravitic devices. One of those conspiracy theories which has been around for 50 years or so is the existence of a scalar wave that's supposedly a type of electromagnetic wave that physicists have missed for 150 years or so. It can be used to generate energy from the vacuum and also for advanced laser weapons.
We're not in a vacuum. I asked her in one of these videos that I was looking at if she's aware of the Searle effect generator, or what they're calling like levitation devices, and how this could be the first possible blueprint or visual representation of what we're calling UFOs. And again, utilizing magnetism as part of the forces within the ether.
And so on. Unfortunately, in 2020, a paper got published on this in a peer-reviewed journal, which claims that the mathematics in question is omitted in the widely accepted version of electrodynamics, presumably for purposes of weapons design secrecy. Can you introduce a new scalar wave or particle into the known theories? Yes, physicists do this all the time. But if we haven't yet seen that scalar, it means it either interacts very rarely with the stuff that we know, or it requires extremely high energies to produce it. Can that couple to gravity? Sure. But you see, gravity is an extremely weak force.
An extremely weak force.
If you want to use gravity to create the acceleration of
Pushing and
planet
pulling
Earth,
energies.
you need the mass of planet Earth. Doesn't matter how much new physics you introduce, it won't change the boring old physics. What about anti-gravity? Believe it or not, I wrote a few papers about the mathematics of anti-gravity just to show that it's possible to do it consistently within the framework of Einstein's theories. But it's not as exciting as it sounds, because it turns out that anti-gravitating matter, if it exists, is not something that we can use. Even if
So she's completely wrong in that, but because again, I could show again like the Searle effect generator and like nuclear radiating energies, you know, like lasers even, and how that's it's more magnetized forces at play. The removal, the absence of electrons, or the electric forces being weakened and then or absent. But again, she does have a lot of other good stuff. It's just again what people are again misinterpreting the laws of physics and how this reality works because of how they're perceiving it. She still thinks it's a globe, probably. I wanted to share this because it was so interesting. I think this is the one where he talks about Schrodinger's cat. He talks about unified, anyway, the slit experiment as well. He talks about
Schrodinger's equation, which describes a cat in a box with a poison and a hammer that's
I like this interpretation of
on
Schrodinger's
some kind of random function, so that you don't know if the hammer has hit the vial and killed the cat as by liberating the poison or not. And the typical analogy is said that if the cat is in the box and the box hasn't been, the state of the cat hasn't been observed or hasn't been measured, the cat is in state of superposition. It is both alive and dead at the same time. This is a remarkable interpretation in physics. And of course, Einstein didn't think it was true. He's known for having asked a famous physicist at one point, do you really believe that if you're not looking at the moon, it's not there? That the cat is in superposition until the box is open and the measurement is made, and then the cat collapses into its final state, either alive or dead, in a completely random function. The problem with that is the assumption that because the cat is in a box, it's isolated from the universe. And of course not. It's not because the cat is in the box that the universe is confused about the state of the cat. Now, the human on the outside might be confused about the state of the cat, or the human equipment on the outside might be confused about the state of the cat.
Yeah, sun gazing. Whenever I'm not feeling like 100%, actually I try to do it all the time anyways, but like I go outside, like even in the snow I was doing yesterday and the day before, and then grounding and then sun gazing when there was no cloud coverage. But yeah, I do believe that it's very healing. Definitely helps. And actually,
but gravitational fields, electromagnetic fields are all going through that box, and it doesn't matter how well it's insulated, if it's a Faraday cage or not, and so on. And so you know, there's a misinterpretation there. And then what about the observation of the flea on the cat? What does not matter with the universe? What about the microbes that are inside the box? Those are frames of observation that could collapse the quantum waveform. In quantum physics, that's called a fractional problem. It was mentioned in a recent paper from a very famous physicist, and that there's a fundamental problem with this interpretation of quantum theory, and it really is a way that almost 100 years ago, kind of quantum physics took a completely different path, a path in which nothing could be visualized, in which the only physics that could be written at the quantum level were really statistical analysis, probability curves, and the position of everything, or its velocity, its direction, could not be found. And so there is a new interpretation. I mean, it's not actually that new. De Broglie and Bohm, early on, realized that there was a second option to the interpretation of the double slit experiment. That is, that instead of seeing that the particle is some kind of entity that's moving in a field-free environment. And of course, then if it goes through one slit and you're getting an interference pattern coming from the other slit, you think that somehow the particle was in a state of superposition, it went through both slits at the same time and interfere with itself. Then it gets really esoteric and really out there and actually not realistic at all. This quantum weirdness thing. The universe is clearly, very organized and is not seem to be
Organized
at the larger scale
and contained.
resulting of some quantum weirdness. How is it that it organizes at larger scale if it's made of quantum entities? Well, there's another alternative, and I think that one is much more plausible, and that is that the particle is actually moving in a field, and that field is interacting with the particle. In fact, from the physics I've written, the particle itself that's going through the slit is made of the field. You can think of the particle as a little vortex in that field. And I think that's very relevant to all you practitioners working with the subtle energy of the body. In any case, of course, when the particle moves through the field, it makes waves. And if the field has waves in it as well, it will guide the particle in a certain way. And the wave moving in the field, interaction with the field, will produce very specific effects. So de Broglie and Bohm solved these equations, but because the earlier Copenhagen interpretation had taken root, nobody really paid attention until actually fairly recently, where a French physicist and then eventually MIT basically took a back of fluid, in this case silicone fluid, put little silicone beads on it, oscillated the back of silicone fluid to simulate the oscillation of a field, and then shot the little beads of silicone at two slits. And they got all the same results as you get from the double slit experiments, including quantum tunneling and all the interpretation that were done by the Copenhagen meetings were able to be reproduced just with fluid dynamics and beads, showing that actually there's a classical fluid dynamic explanation to the double slit experiment. And of course, if you put a probe in there, if you put a measurement instrument, if you put anything in there in the field, in this case in the back of fluid, that interferes with the waves that the particle is making, of course you're going to get a different result, and you're going to think that the observer has changed the result of the experiment. But in this case, it's basically that everything in the experiment, anything you add to the experiment, anything that's in the experiment is interacting with the field that connects all the parts. And so, of course, if you add things to the field, it's going to change the result. And I think that has a lot more wisdom to it. And, this is called pilot wave theory, de Broglie-Bohm theorem. And it's gaining momentum because the experiments are showing very clearly that all the results of the double slit experiment can be interpreted in fluid dynamics, in field dynamics. And I think this is actually very important for us. A lot of what we do in subtle energy work has to do with this interpretation that there is a field that our body is interacting with. In ancient time, most ancient civilization talked about that field. It was called chi or prana or mana or many different things, but it was all describing a field of information, a field of energy that connects everything, that's around everything, that's in everything, and that you can affect that field. And so I think that actually, although it might be disappointing for people that we can't tag on consciousness on the standard Copenhagen interpretation, I think it's really exciting that now pilot wave theory, that's becoming more and more popular in physics, is actually giving us a much more clear picture of why practitioners are able to affect particle in their vicinity or even at the distance by interacting with a fundamental field that is present, and that has been, it used to be there prior to Einstein. It was called the ether. When Einstein field equations were rendered, they felt like they could get rid of the ether. Einstein at the time kind of agreed, but eventually came back around in his later years and said, my equations are invalid without an ether. The ether medium was this field that was thought to be everywhere in the space that carried the electromagnetic fields, that carried the electromagnetic spectrum, the light spectrum. Now, this field is coming back, and it's coming back in a more understandable way, meaning that we have better details on how it functions, what it does. Certainly, my equations show that this field, which is present in quantum theory, it's called a vacuum fluctuation. It's present in the very specific part of quantum theory called quantum field theory, which when quantum field theory and the Dirac equations were rendered, showing that there is at the very fine level, way smaller than the nuclei of an atom, there is oscillations in the structure of space-time, electromagnetic oscillations that are significant, and that we should pay attention to those. So basically, it's that field has been there, whether we like it or not, throughout the ages. It's just not being understood, and it certainly has not been understood as the foundation of the material world. So now, eventually, you get to the equations I've been writing, and all of a sudden you see that these little Planck oscillators, so that's how they're called, because the field that we're talking about is oscillating at the Planck scale. The Planck scale is very, very, very fine. It's way, way smaller than the material world, like even the nuclei of an atom. So let me try to give you some kind of idea of scale. Well, let's start with your body. Your body is made out of about 100 trillion cells. That has a lot of cells, right? So cells are already small because there's about 100 trillion in your body. They're all functioning perfectly. There's cell divisions occurring, millions of cells dividing every minute. There's billions of chemical changes occurring every second for you to be alive, right? So all these processes, it's highly complex, and the stuff is really fine, right? Cells are already fine. Well, a cell is made out of approximately 100 trillion atoms. So that's how small atoms are. And now if I grew one atom, so it was the Dome of the Vatican, which, like, you're about that big in the Dome of the Vatican. It's about 42-meter diameter. It's huge, right? And you took the head of a pin, in the middle of the Dome of the Vatican. If the electron cloud of the atom was Dome of the Vatican, then the head of the pin would be the nuclei of that atom. It would be the proton in the middle. And so if I took a little Planck entity, which has a radius or a diameter of 10 to the 33 centimeters, 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, right? That's a period with
like he shows
33 zeros, right?
That's what I mean. I really wish that the people, like the particle physicists, would see this world for what it is. Anyway, he's super smart though.
The material world. So my equations show that, and they're very precise, that actually if you count the number of bits of information inside the proton, and there's a lot of them, when you count the number of Plancks inside the proton, and each Planck is a little oscillator, so it has a little mass. When you calculate the mass of all the little Plancks inside the proton, you get the exact mass of the universe. So you get the mass of all the other protons, because the universe is pretty well the mass of the protons. You get the mass of all the other protons in the universe, or all the information of all the other protons in the universe in one specific proton. And then you calculate the amount of little Plancks on the surface of the proton. So now imagine you got all the information of the universe inside, but you have a limited amount of information on the surface. So now you have entropy. Not all the information inside can express itself outside. So what I wanted to know is, what's the ratio of this entropy? What is the energy of this entropy? So I did the ratio between the outside and the inside. And then I multiplied it by the energy of one Planck to get the energy of the ratio. And it gives me the exact mass of the proton.
Euclidean
geometry. And if I did it for a black hole in the universe, it'd give me the exact mass of the black hole. So all of a sudden, I could prove that the mass of all the material world, is actually the result of the little Planck's information network moving about. So that every Planck has all the information in the universe, and it's interacting, every proton, I'm sorry, it has all the information in the universe, and it's interacting with all the other protons, okay? And this interaction, not being able to express itself fully because it's limited by the amount of Planck on the surface, this entropy is what we call mass. And using that, I was able to extrapolate exactly what should be the radius, the exact radius of the proton. And I published that as a prediction. And then a few months later, unknown to me, they were trying to measure the...
I might get back to him. But again, like just like reinforcing like a elemental, as in like the periodic table of elements, elemental particles, and how whether they're like more negatively or positively charged, it's dependent on things like temperature, density, and pressure, and the medium through what they operate through, like like the visible and non-visible light spectrum and audible spectrum, also connected to that. It's the medium in which it travels through. Like I said, like earlier on, I want to get into the Hadron Collider and share my interpretation of that. Where is it? I'm blinded here.
Hadron Collider. It's a massive.
Never have a complete vacuum that's void of particles. Even in what they're calling like the universe in space, they also collectively agree to that as well. They're just not putting pieces together.
It's a beautiful piece of human ingenuity and engineering. And wait a minute, that's not the LHC. This is the LHC. This is the Large Hadron Collider, or LHC for short. It's a 27-kilometer particle accelerator sitting under the border of France and Switzerland. It's an atom smasher, the biggest in the world, designed and built by thousands of engineers, scientists, and mathematicians from across our tiny planet with the goal of helping other scientists learn about things of incredibly small size by smashing them together. These smashings are called collisions.
This is really all they're interested in.
Yeah.
They're interested in collisions, collisions, collisions.
That's Mike Lamont. He's the operations group leader working on the LHC. It's his job to run BEAM. BEAM being nerdy lingo for bunches of hydrogen protons that fill up the LHC. The LHC is a ring containing two beams going in opposite directions. But if we look closer, that beam is actually made up of bunches of protons.
In fact, each bunch has about 100 billion protons each. And these bunches are about 30 centimeters long, typically about 1 millimeter dimensions as they're going around the ring. And so think about a long, thin, tapered piece of spaghetti.
Incredibly powerful superconducting magnets keep the beams flying at nearly the speed of light with the aim of making these proton bunches hit.
We pass these thin hairs through each other and we get about 30 collisions. So most of the protons just miss each other and they carry on around the ring. They come back one turn later and they can do it again.
And the reason why they miss each other is because atoms are mostly empty space. So getting them to collide is incredibly difficult. It would be like standing 10 kilometers apart and trying to shoot two needle-thin arrows at each other so they hit halfway. So the key is to do this a lot.
The target this year, just to put it in context, is about 800 million collisions a second. So we really we have to work hard to get that rate.
Hundreds of millions per second is insane. Imagine trying to control a proton traveling at nearly the speed of light. To keep the bunches on track, the LHC uses dipole magnets, or two magnets. But when they need to steer the protons, they use quadrupole magnets, or four
magnets.
One on each compass point, applying 300 to 400 metric tons of force per meter.
So we take our pieces of spaghetti and focus them down with very strong quadrupole magnets, which act like lenses, to get them down to the diameter of a human hair as we pass them through each other in the center of the experiments.
And that is why the LHC is in the business of collisions. The LHC is sort of like your power company, but instead of providing electricity, they're generating collisions. More collisions, more better. They spend all their effort to try and get these bunches of hydrogen ions to hit inside of other scientists' experiments. Of course, having a collision is great, but if a proton collides in the woods and no one's there, does it make a boson? Who knows? The scientists still have to be watching at just the right fraction of a second to discover a new particle. That's where these experiments come in. They sit on the LHC ring at collision points, and they're probably what you think of when you hear Large Hadron Collider. The famous ones are ATLAS and CMS, which spotted the famous Higgs boson back in 2013.
It's called CMS, compact muon solenoid. However, it really is not compact. It's a relative term. As you can see, nothing of that size is compact.
Dr. Tulika Bose sits in the control room of the CMS waiting for an exciting collision to happen inside her 3-story science experiment, all thanks to the LHC.
So they collide about 25 nanoseconds. So you have a bunch colliding with another bunch. You may have a proton here and a proton here, which has a hard, what we call scattering, a hard event. And out of that comes out a whole mess of particles.
This is what she's talking about. When 2 protons collide, it looks like this. To you and me, this may look like a whole mess of particle parts, but to Dr. Bose, this mess can actually tell you what's inside a proton.
There are 2 important pieces of information that we get from this. One is whether it's curving this way or if it's curving that way. That tells us whether it's positively charged or negatively charged. And then how large is the radius of curvature? Because it could be curving like this, or it could be curving in a much larger radius. And this has a direct relationship with essentially what the velocity and consequently what the momentum of the particle is.
And this is why the LHC is awesome. Dr. Bose is basically watching millions of proton car crashes in order to reverse engineer the automobile. Smashing atoms together can reveal what they're made of. But instead of injectors, plastic, steel, and glass, physicists find neutrons, kaons, pions, muons, and neutrinos. By the way, physicists call particles that are made of these things hadrons, hence the name Large Hadron Collider. Proton collisions like these help physicists reveal exactly what these tiny structures that make up our universe are made of. The technology is super advanced, but the science is the same as it's always been. We simply break things apart, hoping to understand how they tick.
Yeah. I will say what ChatGPT says. What the question I had. Sorry about the light. Just some at a weird angle and it's getting obscured by my windows in my office. Anyway, because there can exist a proton with a neutron, but when you ask, okay, can there exist an electron with a nucleus or a neutron with a neutron and no proton? Yes, such a system can theoretically exist and is known as a hydrogen-like atom with only a neutron and an electron, often called a neutronium atom, which they were just talking about in that video, or neutronic hydrogen. However, it would be extremely unstable. Here's why. No Coulomb attraction. In a typical atom, the positive charged nucleus, protons, attracts the negatively charged electron, keeping it bound. A neutron has no charge, so it wouldn't exert an electrostatic force to hold the electron in place. Weak interaction is too weak, redundant. While neutrons interact via the weak nuclear force and the strong nuclear force with the nuclei, these forces are not strong enough to hold an electron in a stable orbit like the Coulomb force does in regular atoms. Neutron decay. A free neutron is unstable and has a half-life of about 10 minutes before it decays into a proton. An electron and an anti-neutrino. Sorry, it's just hard to see because, anyway, via beta decay. If a neutron were bound to an electron in some temporary system, it would likely decay before any meaningful interactions occurred. Could it exist briefly? There might be fleeting quantum mechanical interactions where an electron is weakly associated with a neutron, but these would not form a stable atomic structure. Some theoretical studies suggest possible ultra-weak bound states of neutrons and electrons due to polarization effects, but these would be extremely short-lived. So while a system with a neutron and electron could momentarily exist, and again, I'm saying I don't think it could, it wouldn't be a stable atom in the way we understand atomic structures. And so I'm really hoping this is could be useful to people. Because again, it also proves the ether and again, particle physics and how particles create waves, like sonar waves, radar waves, all those, like the Wi-Fi signals you see, these are waves that are being created by particles. Oh yeah, this was very interesting as well. Yeah, she has some good stuff.
about is without doubt nuclear fusion. This is because I think that the growth and prosperity of a civilization is ultimately determined by its energy access. Today, I want to tell you about a new nuclear fusion startup in New Zealand that's come up with an idea I've never heard about before, and they just reached their first milestone. Let's have a look. For half a century, nuclear fusion seemed pretty much unachievable, but in the past decade, we've seen startups popping up all around the world with new ideas for how to get it done. There are now more than 40 fusion startups, most of them in the United States, and the total funding exceeds $7 billion. But not all is sunny. Several of these companies made promises that they almost certainly already regret. The UK company First Light Fusion, which is shooting projectiles at nuclear fuel pellets, for example, said in 2019 they'd achieve energy gain by 2024. The American company Commonwealth Fusion, which uses the well-trodden tokamak approach, said in 2021 they'd commercialize their technology by 2025. They've now moved that date to 2027. Most of the nuclear fusion startups say they'll deliver power to the grid before 2035, so the next 10 years will be very interesting. The big challenge for nuclear fusion is that one needs to push small atomic nuclei into each other against the electric repulsion between them. The sun does that with its enormous pressure created by its own gravitational pull. Here on Earth, the methods that scientists use to create sufficient pressure come in three broad classes. There are those that trap and heat nuclear plasma with magnetic fields, known as magnetic confinement. Then there are those that shoot at fuel pellets, known as inertial confinement. And then there are some which combine both. We talked about all these in a previous episode, but basically it's trap it, zap it, or hope that no one asks exactly how it works. The company which just made headlines is called OpenStar and was founded in 2021 in Wellington. They're a private company that has so far attracted about $12 million in funding. They're using a type of magnetic trap-it design called a dipole fusion reactor. As the name suggests, it works with a magnetic dipole field. This is a very simple field like that of a standard magnet with two poles. In the often used tokamak design, which is what ITER uses, one has a vessel that has the shape of a torus or donut or bagel or whatever your favorite bakery comparison. The plasma must be made to float inside the vessel without touching the walls because it's so incredibly hot. In the dipole fusion reactor, on the other hand, the plasma vessel does not have a hole in the middle. Instead, one levitates a big torus-shaped magnet inside of the vessel. That magnet creates the dipole field. If the magnet is superconducting, it can be strong enough to trap the plasma and heat and compress it, hopefully enough for fusion to set in. The idea was proposed by physicist Akira Hasegawa in the 1980s. MIT then had a small test device which ran from 2004 to 2011, but it was discontinued due to lack of enthusiasm, basically. Like with all other nuclear fusion technologies, the problem is just to get more energy out than one needs to put in. OpenStar is now building on the MIT results and wants to optimize the design to create net energy. The dipole design has several advantages over the tokamak. The biggest advantage is its simplicity, which helps to stabilize some of the turbulences that can occur in nuclear plasma. Turbulence is bad because it can allow the plasma to hit the reactor vessel, which would damage it. Therefore, if it looks like turbulence sets in, the reactor needs to be shut down quickly. This is not a way to efficiently create energy. Turbulence is the biggest headache for magnetic confinement. The dipole design can't entirely avoid it, but the math says that the risk should be much lower, and the MIT results partly confirm this. This is an advantage not just because it's easier to build, but also because it's more efficient, and because it's easier to build, it's less costly. The biggest disadvantage is that one brings in a new instability, which is that the superconducting magnet itself needs to be kept levitating in place. This requires a high-precision control system with active feedback, something that artificial intelligence has now made dramatically simpler. OpenStar now recently announced that they've made a big step forward. They've created and contained a plasma cloud for 20 seconds at around 300,000 degrees Celsius. 20 seconds doesn't sound like much, but for the first test run, that's pretty amazing. Just take my word for it. The last time I tried holding something together for 20 seconds, it was a yoga position and it didn't end well. On their website, the company says that producing energy from fusion is as little as 6 years away. And since it's Christmas, I'll just choose to believe it. After all, the holiday season is all about hope. Hope for peace, hope for clean energy, and hope that this year my mum doesn't burn the turkey. If everything goes according...
So another interesting video. I really want to focus on quantum physics, but I do want to get back into John Searle and magnetic energy. And then even Tesla and Walter Russell were talking about using like sound vibration to levitate and utilize that, like sound and magnetic forces. Anyway, not gravity. And now with sound.
Impossible, except that the state of your mind makes it so. Cleaning up this planet is going to be a big job. If we could
laterally and not be bound by conventional rules taught through conventional methods that may have an adverse effect on the human mind. John Searle is known all over the world as the inventor of the Searle effect generator, a magnetic device consisting of one or more rings, also called plates, and a number of cylindrical rollers that, when in motion, generate electricity.
Kind of like this cosmos.
Generator is a magnetic device that is totally magnetic. It is its own prime mover. It will self-start and continue to run, and as far as we know, we could say never stop.
The Searle effect is an effect based on magnetic fields that generate the continual motion of magnetized rollers around magnetized rings, producing electric energy.
The generator runs in harmony with nature. The law of the squares is harmony with nature.
Like this divine clock.
But the Searle effect is a great deal more than a simple generator. In our polluted and energy-starved world, it is the hope of all mankind that we find the solutions that lead us to both prosperity and harmony with nature. Is it possible to maintain mankind's industrial output and at the same time reduce the pollutants that are slowly killing planet Earth?
Yes.
Is there a way to increase the productivity of the human species as we rid ourselves of the poisons and recover the waters of this world?
If we could get the climate back to what we want, a lot of work could be done. One thing is certain, you need energy. That's important. And it must be cheap as possible. Preferable, no pollution.
No noise, no heat, no vibration, no pollution. The Searle effect generator. The perfect machine?
As you build this, when you find out that it runs without friction, it runs without a governor, it will accept any load and meet it. It will dive down in temperature at one point if you build it correctly and actually levitate and actually lift off the Earth, developing its own gravitational field. When you see all these things and you realize that this is a perfect machine. It is an entity. It's the closest thing to a living thing that man can make.
Does John Searle have the answer? Is John Searle's invention the point of impact between the question, what if there is a machine that could save mankind, and the answer, the Searle effect generator?
People say, well, you can't do this. You're going to upset the entire world economy. The whole economy is based on oil, and it works, they're saying. Well, it works very well for the people who are running the economy, but not necessarily for everyone else. I still maintain that it will not ruin the economy. It will be a very strong paradigm shift, much the same as the shift from horse and buggy to automobile.
Surely this point of impact would produce energy of its own, human energy, emotional energy, joy, relief, hope, wonder, or perhaps the darker side of human emotions, greed, hate, and jealousy.
All these years I've learnt one thing: you can't trust anyone with this technology. They've got to steal it. And any worker seeing this and find out how it works could sell it to another company for millions.
Because this, too, is the Searle effect. Put simply, quantum mechanics is the study of the relationship between energy and matter. In particular, the relationship between electrons and photons, the area in which the actual Searle effect takes place.
It's photons. That's the role of grounding their energy to the coil. It is simply throwing photons out. That is what you see trapped in the magnetic field around it.
Yes, just like the
Albert Einstein's contribution, E equals mc squared, made way for huge strides in science. Very soon, abstract mathematical proofs would replace ether theory as the best explanation of all things and their relativity.
Yep.
Others, like Nikola Tesla, would cling to the idea that energy was all around us and that we could access this energy and transport it through the atmosphere without the need for meters or utility companies. While the greatest minds of the 20th century uncovered theories about how the universe works, far beneath this lofty exchange, John Searle was dreaming.
I had dreams, and those dreams are the key to all the work which I do. In fact, they're the key to all my knowledge.
The Searle effect is developed from the law of the squares, and it is from these squares that John Searle developed his generator and flying discs. But it didn't stop there. Over the course of his lifetime, John Searle's understanding of the squares would be used by him to explain.
I just saw that aircraft, that UFO. That also looks very similar to like what was introduced shortly thereafter of what they were alleging were these UFOs or flying saucers in the air.
All aspects of life in the universe, from DNA to relativity, from single-celled life to the human being, from transportation to construction of buildings, the squares could be used to understand everything.
When I took up my training as an apprentice electrical engineer, about the third day, I was presented a docket to take to the stores, and I saw this tube with a small tube buff. I asked the foreman what that meant. He said, that's 2 square. So I said, well, what is 2 squares? So he draws 2 by 2, show me 4 squares. 4. But you can take a square, if you run the numbers in normal, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that is uniform in. But when you total them up, each row, each column, each diagonal, you'll find they add up different. Putting numbers in random, we come up with a uniform output. Every line, every column, the 2 diagonals come out precisely the same.
Random numbers in squares will produce a uniform total. John Searle would soon call this the law of the squares, nature's way of achieving order from chaos. This led to Searle's revelation. From those numbers, John Searle had the exact amount of each ingredient in the rollers and rings of his generator.
Now, every 1 square represents a quantity of a material, and that's very important.
Yep, a reservoir, a gate magnetic emitter.
This is precisely how I developed the SEG. So I copy nature in every way. I work at trying to think how nature's doing it, and then produce this object.
World War II had ended, brought about by the most devastating weapons ever conceived. The product of those lofty minds who 20 years earlier wondered what would happen if you hit a single atom hard enough. What kind of energy was stored in this tiny place? The answer, they thought, is the source of all energy in the universe. The practical answer was bang. In fact, the biggest bang mankind could ever devise.
Einstein opened the door a bit further.
And these mushroom clouds, they're toroidal fields that are created.
like most people, they
magnetic energy.
Come up with a wonderful formula. Einstein did. And then he stops at that and says, there's no way you can get this massive energy out of an atom. The cost would be too high. It's not worth it. Then you see you get another person comes along and thinks about this. Oh, no, just bump it with a proton or a neutron.
Some of the vocabulary, words like volts, ohms, amps, and watts. By 1946, John Searle had a different idea. How could this energy be tapped without smashing the atom into bits? His idea was a completely new generator design.
We didn't call them self-effect generators then, but we were just trying to produce a generator to run the house lights on, because I felt that the big generators at the power stations were a waste of money, would present to us vast pollution problems in the future. So the whole idea was to get something to produce electricity.
Basically, the design is a conventional generator as far as how it looks. You've got a magnet passing by a coil, and all generators of electricity are based on magnetics and coils. You can pass a coil by a magnet or a magnet by a coil, but that gives you your deflection in the electron flow and the force in one direction.
I already knew most of the fundamentals. What I was doing here was trying to get rid of the petrol engine or other devices to turn the generator. That was the objective.
The two key issues are electrons and magnetic fields. John Searle understood the basic principles for generating electricity. He knew electricity was made up of electrons traveling down the wires into our homes.
To generate, you've got to have electrons for motion, great motion. That's why you go to the rare earth.
The primary component is a rare earth. Although it can be any of the rare earths, the component that we use is neodymium. That's element number 60 on the periodic chart. And that unit puts out an excess of electrons for some reason, and it will also replenish them very easily.
Rare earth is the greatest weight of the whole materials that you're using. That has got to hold the mass of electrons.
John Searle's idea was to find a way to ease those spare electrons out of the structure and use them. Instead of smashing the atom into bits, why not tap this vast electron reservoir by using magnetic fields, same as any generator of that time?
So I say to myself, if you can release all the energy with a simple particle, surely we could ease it out gently by tunneling it in and giving it something to run up. So if we put a straight line, magnetic line, through, and the electron spins around, all this energy is spinning around and come out, we'll get a constant flow.
Tunneling into the atom using
and neodymium was also used in like glass dies. And there's so much
specific magnetic field will cause the electrons to move in one direction, and they can be collected and used.
With production of electricity, you have two choices. You either rotate the magnetic field or you rotate the conductors. In our case, we rotate the magnetic flux. So as the roller rotates, it's also rotating around the base plate.
To make his generator work, John Searle had to overcome many problems. Most of these occurred with the shape and design of his magnets and in the behavior of their magnetic fields. How can you make a round magnet orbit another round magnet without stopping or flying off? He studied the behavior of a bar magnet and a round magnet.
There's something wrong with this. It's got a turning action on it. It was tormenting me. That must be able to go straight. I placed it on and it kept straight. And not only did it keep straight, it freely moved up and down. What happens if you make a ring?
He knew magnetic fields could be impressed or printed on certain materials using a magnetizer, a device common to shops and factories that use magnets.
Question that's the scientist is why and see what's on, they just run round.
Neodymium also in like powder and liquid form is like it's like a violet, like, and again the connection as well with like the visible and non-visible light spectrum, like the ultraviolets. correlated with like the sun and protons and magnetic nuclear forces, and yeah, it's very interesting.
Wow. The picture here was there was 2 states involved here, and of course there is.
The 2 states referred to the 2 magnetic fields printed at right angles to each other.
And even with the 7th chakra being the crown chakra, when you look at the petals for how they look like how they demonstrate the energy systems, when you look at the root chakra, it has the least amount of petals. When you look at the crown chakra, it has absolutely like the most amount of petals, 1,000 petals. And this shows stronger toroidal fields. When you do a top-down view of magnetic fields or toroidal fields, Ken Wheeler actually has some really good videos on that. It looks, again, like a lotus with a lot of different petals, right? And the stronger the magnetic force or the field, the more circular it appears, and it being a stronger force. And so the more you access your higher levels of consciousness and get into the crown chakra, which is correlated with the sun and stuff like that, it's also, again, like more magnetic, which is I've been talking about as well. And anyway, I'm rambling.
Both the roller and the plate had independent magnetic fields, one vertical and the other radial from the center to the rim.
Clearly, the magnetic field was completely different to the magnetic fields we knew of. For some reason, why they were different at the time, I had no idea.
The intersection of these 2 fields produces a wave that carries the roller around the ring, although this wave was unknown at the time the phenomenon was present.
So we got fields at right angles. That's why the whole thing moves. If you haven't got 2 fields, it won't move.
Now the 2 key issues for the production of electricity were present in a totally new generator design. The electrons were available in the rare earth material. The magnetic fields induced the roller to run on the plate.
We didn't even know what the field looked like till a few years ago in Germany when we remade a segment. I said, well, let's have a look at this field. And we dusted it with very fine iron dust, shook off the surface. Do you know what that looked like? A bicycle wheel. That is the field that makes this work. Any other field won't work. That field does it.
So we know that the magnetic field can be set to perform functions quite different to what we were taught in my day at school. And I think we're only scratching the surface of magnetism.
Was this thing a generator? It created an extremely high voltage, but John Searle had no control over it whatsoever. With each experiment came a new set of questions.
My magnetism is not your magnetism.
Could it be that general magnetism contains multiple bands, a magnetic spectrum, exactly the same as white light contains a spectrum of colors?
Magnetism is identical to light. In a way, that's how I look at it. They're identical, they're pairs.
Me too, John.
John Searle used a combination of AC and DC current when magnetizing the components of his generator.
If we isolate the particular band we want, and then print that, we have something different, we have a wave.
This is the Searle effect, the intersection of 2 magnetic fields creating a magnetic wave that can be measured and amplified. John Searle designed a generator using magnetic fields to induce a flow of electrons from a rare earth element through a system of rotating magnetized components so that those electrons would be collected, compressed, used, and recycled. Magnetic forces and electrons in motion, the 2 key issues necessary for the production of electricity.
Is a condition where you can get a wave in a magnetic sense, like a wave, a sine wave.
A sine
and
wave.
They act as a river. Now they're stationary until reaction effects takes place. And
when you map out the sun, just like a Ferris wheel, like with the carriage going around the Ferris wheel, when you map it out, amplitude versus distance or degrees, because degrees are measurable distances, it maps out a sine wave. And so that's why I also believe that the sun is smaller, more localized, and it travels in like a circuit or a circle above us through these rings. And I believe that it's magnetic, radiating positive energy.
Do that, you have to set a cylinder on it, magnetize, and then that wave goes into motion.
another roller placed on that field, it floats. We know it cannot touch that, it's too dense with energy, so it will float. So we got something floating there. Then if this wave is moved due to reaction between this plate, this roller and this plate, then that wave is going to carry that regardless. So the roller maintains still its constant height. Though it's now running many times faster, it does not fly off.
The magnetic field is holding the roller tightly to the plate. At the same time, the electrons moving through the layered elements are collected and compressed on the surface of the plate, lifting the roller and creating space between the roller and the plate.
So the roller flies round
space
and doesn't roll round. As it moves, the fields be rewritten all the time. So the field never diminishes. It cannot diminish because a magnetic field is in constant running order.
The energy or electrons moving through the system recycle. The rare earth element attracts new electrons that also move through the system and recycle. Because of their negative charge, the electrons compress, causing the drop in temperature and creating the energy field that radiates from the generator.
In 1956, I was soldering. I had to produce another unit, and this time we wasn't powering it up. I wanted to try to meter up things to see what the oscilloscope was showing me. And it was accidental that when I took the hot iron to solder the wire on, I couldn't solder it. Something from the machine was cooling things faster than you could heat them. That was accounting for some of the behavior of those early models. Counted for why, when I got a hold of it, I was stuck to it.
John Searle created a generator design that became a superconductor, producing extreme cold and incredibly high voltage that caused it to lift off the ground. But could he control this flying disc generator?
One thing I didn't know was that gravity can be inversed. No scientists ever had come up with that idea. That clearly the magnetic field was completely different to the magnetic fields we have.
So these gravitational forces can be inversed based on opposing forces and all that other stuff.
Cool.
The heavy rollers spinning as they rotate around the plates acted like a flywheel and caused a gyroscopic effect. The extremely high voltage created a dense field surrounding the generator, a device built with individually magnetized components. Incorporating these principles displayed by the device, he christened it Gyro Flywheel High Energy Density Mechanical Magnetic Device, but it would soon be known as the Levity Disc.
You've got to put a load, resistance load, on the generator to speed it up. And once it starts, you get to about...
And again, it looks like what we're calling UFOs. These are advanced technologies that are being used by Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, NASA, General Dynamics, all of these companies. This has been out for decades. Like this, this is decades.
On average, about 1 million volts. It begins.
And we had advanced technologies, again, even possibly even thousands of years ago, when you look at hydroglyphs and petroglyphs that have not been ruined, destroyed, covered over, sunken, exploded. Like you see these poles that look like energy harnessing poles. And then you look at old infrastructure that was created, again, a couple thousand years ago, all over the world, the ones that are still that still exist. And you see even within the columns that they're like resonators and generators of energy. And they use like antennas with various different materials that are either like conductive of electricity or of anyways, free energy.
To really build up a charge.
Light.
Then this superconductivity switches in and the Earth pushes it up. But it's also affecting the atmosphere above it. It is making it pull to the rim and rotate with a field. So you've got like a hurricane effort. It's sucking it up. There's a magnetic field. There's a gap, a vacuum between that and the rim. And it's the photons, which is discharged, trapped by the magnetic field, which gives it the glow.
Basically, the solar effect was meant to turn the ether, which is all around us, which contains energy, and tap into this energy, which has euphemistically now been known as 0-point energy. And various other people who followed Searle's footsteps have also potted around, and they've tapped into it by mistake.
I can understand why people would have difficulty in understanding it, because it does take a great deal of effort to make sense of it technically.
Fernando Morris, an electrical engineer and computer specialist, is responsible for the most credible attempt to rebuild the Searle effect generator.
We have something here that needs to be investigated, and really that's my role. I am a technical investigator of the SEG.
In his home laboratory workshop near San Diego, California, Morris is following the footsteps of John Searle. Personally guided by Searle himself, he is rebuilding the generator precisely as Searle did long ago. Morris developed the unit that reveals a magnetic sine wave in the Searle generator.
That's how I started off, is to try to build a magnetizer for it. And if I could develop this sine wave, which I'd never heard of before, I think we're onto something, and we can build upon that. Now that is proven, repeatable, and I've got the unit to do that. It's a process of magnetizing the rollers and the plate. And when you develop sine waves on it, in effect, you're developing a motor. And that's essential if it's going to be a viable device.
That's exactly what I've been saying since 1946. There is a waveform in a magnetic domain on that metal. And the scientists say impossible.
After years of studying Searle's books, trying to decipher their meaning, and endless question and answer sessions with the man himself, what does he know that assures him Searle is right?
I'm going to release a piece of information here that I haven't shared before, and that is the law of squares. That's one of those question marks right now, is how does that come about? It took me a while to understand it, but what it is, it represents time, space, and energy. And what it says, it's in a random state. That's not useful energy.
Yeah, anyways, let him explain it.
But what John has done is he has transposed that matrix so that the output is uniform. And within nature, uniformity means resonance. So if you can resonate that random energy, you got yourself an electric current, because electrons are the only things that are free to move on metal. So
sorry, I'm looking into on this day in history, his story, right? It's a lot of it's fake news, but it said this is for yesterday. I didn't do a video yesterday, but I was saying, oh, like if you look at if you go by dates and go by day, month, and then year, but like by day and month, yesterday was 0127. Or even if you want to do, 2701, that's what I wanted to say. So if you go by day and then month, it's 27. Yesterday was the 27th day of the first month. And you've got the 1027 in there that I've talked about so much that like even with the with 9/11, the towers that went down, it was towers 1, 2, and 7, and then they called it ground zero. And then these are usually numbers that are used when people are lying or misleading or misrepresenting events, right? So yesterday, you know, you have that the 2701 numbers in there, and that's when they allegedly discovered Antarctica, which might be again like more of a perimeter around other continents, and not just directly south of Patagonia.
What we got here is a converter of random energy into electrical current, and that's the brilliance behind the machine here. Is not only was John able to decipher his matrix, but he was able to make it into a workable device, and that's the SEG.
Morris's mock-up of the SEG needs an outside power source, just like Searle's original back in 1946. This unit does not contain the rare earth material and will not display the Searle effect. It was built to demonstrate Searle's contention that spinning magnets give off an electric charge as measured by the flashing LEDs. What will be the reaction if and when the Searle generator functions as the inventor assures it will?
I think the public will demand to know, why has this technology been ignored? Why have the experts failed to recognize it? John has a solution that is really the ultimate solution, because we're using energy that's already available within nature, and it's benign. I think we have a wonderful opportunity here. It's a shame it hasn't been taken advantage of. I mean, John has been struggling to get this technology out for years.
John A. Thomas Jr. wrote a book about Searle, then formed a corporation with him in 1996, DISC, Direct International Science Consortium, for the purpose of rebuilding the Searle generator. Thomas's study of the Searle effect has convinced him beyond any doubt that Searle is telling the truth.
And the United States has not heard of Professor Searle. They don't know who in the hell he is. The people of this world have been offered this technology in a refined form that's usable since the early 50s.
Yep.
And it was their right to have it. And it's been taken away from them by the media and by the power companies and by the people who are running this economic society. And we have been told that we cannot have this and it can't exist. Yet we could be living in a new world today that we should have had 25 years ago.
John Searle has since reformed the Searle International Space Research Consortium, or SISRC, an offshoot of his earlier organization. The Searle effect generator represents a fork in the road of scientific development that was abandoned nearly a century ago when ether theory became a relic of the past.
The trouble is, we're confronted by a brick wall called the expert scientific world. If they haven't done it or cannot do it, it's impossible to do. All these years, 1964, we were at a peak, we were demonstrating, and still the scientists say it's impossible to do. Really? Well, we're going to show you. They're wrong. And they have held up this technology since 1946 to today.
Perhaps it's easier to believe that Searle's technology does not exist. The Searle effect generator at first look seems to violate known physical laws. Energy must come from somewhere. John says he found it in the rare earth material. Could it be that simple? Searle speaks his own language, a combination of known physics and terms he created to describe his invention. Numbers in squares told Searle that nature has a way of creating order out of chaos. Does the Searle effect generator convert random energy,
the inverse square law used for light,
into usable electricity? When his generator is overloaded, it affects gravity and flies. John says he gave it a body and let it fly. What is the truth? German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer was once quoted as saying, "All truth passes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident." Could it be that John Searle's technology is passing through Schopenhauer's three phases of truth? The movement toward alternative energy sources is worldwide and essential. The promise of a working Searle effect generator represents a paradigm shift and a renewed hope for all life on Earth.
Yeah, this was so interesting. And because I mentioned the inverse square law, I'm going to pop it up. I've talked about this before, so my apologies for being redundant. The inverse square law is a scientific law that describes how the intensity of a physical quantity decreases as the distance from its source increases. It states that the intensity is inversely proportional to the square of the distance from the source. And they show here an example of the intensity of the light source. R1, R2, R3. So 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9. So you get where I'm going with this. The inverse square law applies to many physical quantities, including light, sound, radiation, and gravity. The law can be represented mathematically as this, where the intensity and where I is the intensity and D is the distance. The inverse square law can be used to calculate the distance or intensity of a given radiation. Examples: light. As you move away from a light source, the light appears dimmer. The radiation exposure from a point source decreases as you move away from it for radiation. gravity, the force of gravity between two objects decreases as the distance between them increases. Anyways, there's more to it, but another diagram. Yeah. More into quantum physics, and then I have to go by like pretty soon, but again, this all is connected.
And the question is, how does
I
consciousness
fast
arise
forwarded.
out of it? So-called the hard problem. And
This is lousy. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. And quantum physics. Shantana Augusto Sabatini.
Fortunately, we don't deal with the hard problem at all. It's like consciousness is what's there, is what you're presently experiencing, what I'm presently experiencing. So the question is like how this like structured nature of consciousness, which we call matter, how does that arise? I'm going to go through very quickly kind of a brief history of Western thought. And in this picture represents, let's say, the cosmos of primitive people, what we call primitive people. And it has a darker blue color, which may be vaguely distinguished from the background here, which is representing consciousness. And this central part with a dotted line around it represents the I, the self. In primitive thinking, there is no sharp boundary between self and no self. The whole world is conscious. And the I has not like a sharp division from the non-I. We've moved away from that. And maybe the first major step away from that happened about 2,000-3,000 years ago with monotheistic religions, in which like the notion of a transcendent being beyond the world, and of human beings having a special relationship with this transcendent being, and consciousness being inside the human being or inside God, but not in the world. The world became like the field for human action, for human subjectivity, but it lost its soul. Two major steps in the making of modern cosmology. Copernicus moved us to realize that we're not the center of the universe, that the universe appears from a point of
we
view.
are the center of the universe.
And our point of view is not necessarily located at the center. Another major step in making of our modern consciousness, how did we come to this worldview, which is based on matter, is Descartes and this notion of res extensa and res cogitans as two different dimensions. And Descartes started actually from res cogitans, from mind as primary realization. But the separation he operated, actually, historically, the influence it had on the development of Western thought is that it freed scientists to deal with res extensa and forget about res cogitans. So focusing on the intrinsic laws of what appeared as out there. That's a picture of our world today. It's like we're here, we're no longer at the center, and there's no consciousness out here. There's a vast expanse of inert matter. Consciousness is present in this little dot, in us, if at all. Because we could also, one current interpretation is that consciousness is not there at all. It's somehow an epiphenomenon, an apparent phenomenon, which has no essential reality. This worldview has strong consequences. That's a picture of the world at night that's seen from space. And all those lights are like human presence.
See, this is the where there's light. Largely, this is like obviously where there's electricity, and so what you'll see where like most of the Earth is not inhabited.
And this is an astronaut walking on the moon. And this is the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. But also this.
Plasma orb, maybe.
This is Nigeria, oil fields. And this. So there's some very creative consequences of that worldview, but very destructive also.
Mm-hmm.
The paradox is that within science itself, that worldview, which takes matter as being primary and the essential reality of things, has appeared to be inconsistent and has come into a crisis with quantum physics. Some physicists don't take that crisis too seriously, but there's an increasing number that is taking it very seriously. So what I'm trying next is to give you like a rush course in quantum physics.
Let's see what he has to say.
This is a very famous experiment, which is reproduced in all the first-year texts of quantum physics. It points out some essential features of the theory. The experience consists, there's a beam of particles coming in from the left there, and going through a screen with two slits, A and B, and falling on a photographic plate or some kind of detector on the other side here. Each particle falls on the screen and leaves one specific dot. And the question I'm asking myself is that, what will be the distribution of these dots? What will be the blackening of the photographic plate? And I can do various experiments here. I can close one slit and leave one open. And if I leave, let's say, only slit A open, I will get a distribution somewhat like this, with a maximum in front of the slit and then fading out on the two sides. If I leave just slit B open, I will get a curve like this. Now, if I can assume that each particle either goes through A or through B, then the consequence of that would be that I should see the superposition of these two curves, the sum of these two curves. All that go through A make this one, all that go through B make this one. All together they make, but that's not what I see. What I see is that when both slits are open, the pattern is this wavy thing here. This wavy pattern is typical of when two waves interfere. So I'm dealing with a paradoxical situation here in which what I call particle leaves actually a specific...
Okay, that was already discussed anyways earlier on in the video, and so I do have to take off. That was a call. And so on that note, I will leave it at that. I hope that was very interesting for people. It was to me. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful rest of your day.